The Black Hawk was already at 8,000 feet when they cut her harness. No warning, no countdown. Just the crew chief's knife moving in one clean arc through the straps that kept Staff Sergeant Shinna Sloan Mercer secured to the floor of the helicopter. The blade was sharp. It had been sharpened for exactly this moment. The straps fell away like they had never mattered. And for 1/2 second, Sloan felt the strange weightlessness of a person who has just been erased from every plan that was supposed to keep her alive. Then two sets of hands found her shoulders, and the door opened into nothing. She had 40 seconds. 40 seconds between 8,000 feet of Montana darkness and the frozen surface of the Clark Fork River waiting somewhere below. 40 seconds that would either be the last of her life or the beginning of something that 5 men in that helicopter were not prepared for. This is the story of those 40 seconds and everything that came after. To understand what happened in that helicopter, you have to go back to the morning. You have to go back to the kind of quiet that soldiers learn to mistrust, the quiet that settles over a forward operating base before something goes wrong. The kind of quiet that has a weight to it, like the air before a storm decides what it wants to destroy. Forward Operating Base Ridgeline sat in the shadow of the Bitterroot Mountains in western Montana, established 3 years earlier as a staging point for high-value interdiction operations along the northern supply corridors. The mountains here were not like mountains in a painting. They were jagged and indifferent, their peaks cutting into the sky like something that had been broken and never properly healed. In February, which this was the tail end of a Montana winter cold enough to turn breath into smoke, the Bitterroot Range had the particular cruelty of beautiful things that do not care whether you live or die. Sloan Mercer had been stationed here for 14 months. She knew these mountains the way most people know the inside of their own homes, in the dark by feel without thinking about it. She knew which trails the elk used in November, and which canyon walls caught radio signals, and which stretches of the Clark Fork ran shallow enough to cross, and which looked shallow but were not. The locals, the ranchers, and the few remaining families who had worked this land for generations had given her a name she never asked for and never objected to. They called her the Ghost, the American woman who appeared in the tree line and disappeared again, like morning mist, leaving behind only the evidence that she had been there. A smuggling route shut down, a cache discovered, a network that had operated for 2 years suddenly silent. She had been very effective. That, as it turned out, was the problem. At 06:30 on that February morning, Sloan sat in the corner of the briefing room at FOB Ridgeline with her back to the wall and her rifle across her knees. This was not tactical posturing. It was habit, the kind of habit built into a person after 5 years in the 75th Ranger Regiment, after enough mornings in enough rooms where the information you were about to receive had the potential to kill you if you received it wrong. She was field stripping her rifle, not because it needed cleaning. She had cleaned it the night before with the methodical patience that her bunkmate at Ranger School had once called compulsive, and she had called professional. She was cleaning it now because the action of it gave her hands something to do while her mind worked through the thing that had been sitting in her stomach since Reveille. Something was wrong with today. She could not have told you exactly what. Nothing she could point to and name. It was more like a frequency just below hearing a vibration in the floor that her body registered before her brain caught up. 5 years in the Rangers teaches you to trust that frequency. The soldiers who didn't trust it were the ones whose names ended up on memorial walls. Sloan laid out the bolt carrier group and reached into the left breast pocket of her jacket. Her fingers found the coin before she consciously went looking for it the way they always did. A challenge coin the size of a silver dollar, worn smooth on one face from years of being held. On one side, the crest of the 75th Ranger Regiment. On the other, a line of text engraved by hand, the letters slightly uneven, in a way that made them feel more true than if they had been stamped by a machine. The ground doesn't care how good you are, only how smart. Master Sergeant Leonard Pruitt had given her that coin on her first day in the regiment. He had pressed it into her palm without ceremony, without explanation, and walked away. She had asked him about it 3 weeks later, after she had proven herself enough that he was willing to have a real conversation with her. He had looked at the coin for a moment, then back at her and said, "I had an instructor once who told me that the mountain doesn't grade on effort. The river doesn't grade on intention. Physics doesn't care about your feelings. The only thing that matters out there is whether you thought clearly enough, fast enough, and honestly enough about what was actually in front of you." Pruitt had been killed 18 months later in an accident that had nothing to do with combat. A civilian driver, a wet road, a curve taken too fast. The random brutality of a world that had not been designed to be fair. Sloan had carried the coin every day since. She was holding it when Major Warren Tully walked into the briefing room. Tully was 43 years old and built like a man who had once been in excellent physical condition and had since settled into something that was merely very good. He had the kind of face that commanded rooms without trying, angular, and serious with eyes that were always slightly narrowed, as though he were perpetually reading something in the middle distance that no one else could see. He had been Sloane's commanding officer for 2.5 years. She had gone into the field under his authorization 41 times. She trusted his judgment with the specific calibrated trust that soldiers develop for the people above them. Not blind faith, but something earned through repeated demonstration. He walked to the front of the room. He did not look at her. That was the first thing she noticed. In 41 operations, Tully had always made a point of making eye contact with every person in the briefing room when he entered. It was a small thing. Most people would not have noticed. Sloane noticed everything. He looked at his tablet. He looked at the wall display. He looked at the 5 men seated in the plastic chairs to Sloane's left. He did not look at her. The 5 men were Delta Force. This was not unusual. Joint operations between Ranger support elements and Delta assault teams had become standard over the past 18 months. What was unusual was this particular team. Sloane had worked with Delta operators before and had developed professional relationships with several of them built on mutual respect between people who had seen each other perform under pressure. She did not know these 5. Their leader sat closest to the front, one ankle resting on the opposite knee, his posture communicating the specific relaxation of a man who has nothing to prove. Master Sergeant Garrett Voss, call sign Wraith. She had heard the name. Everyone in the special operations community had heard the name. Voss had a record that read like a highlight reel: multiple combat deployments, a Silver Star, a reputation for operational effectiveness that had apparently extended, though she did not know this yet, into areas that had nothing to do with defending the United States of America. His face was all sharp edges and old scars, the kind of face that suggested he had been in a great many violent situations and had emerged from all of them intact. Not unscathed, intact. There was a difference. He glanced at Sloane when she looked at him, and the glance was entirely neutral, the way you look at furniture. She looked away. Tully began the briefing. Operation Iron Veil, high-value target moving through the Bitterroot corridor. Victor Harlan, 47, a former logistics contractor turned weapons broker who had spent the last 4 years building a supply network that moved illegal arms from Eastern European sources through Canadian border crossings and into the hands of domestic criminal organizations. 3 federal agencies had been trying to locate Harlan for 16 months. ISR had finally placed him in a cabin complex near Lolo Pass, scheduled to move within 72 hours. Delta takes point on the ground, Tully said. Standard interdiction. Voss leads the assault element. Sergeant Mercer, you're riding along for terrain support. Overwatch from the air only. No ground ops. The room shifted slightly, the way the air shifts when a door opens in a closed space. Not dramatically, just enough that she felt it. Terrain support. She had led 17 operations in this specific corridor. She knew every approach vector to the Lola Pass area, every elevation change, every place where the terrain could either save you or kill you depending on which side of it you were on. And Tully was putting her in the helicopter. She reassembled her rifle, each piece back in sequence, her hands working from memory. Copy that, sir, she said. Tully moved on to the assault plan. Sloane filed every detail approach, vectors, contingency routes, extraction points, the location of the cabin complex relative to 3 different terrain features she could have described in her sleep. She filed it all because she always filed everything, not because she thought she would need it, but because you always needed things you thought you wouldn't need, because the ground didn't care how good you were. Across the room, Specialist Declan Ferris caught her eye. Ferris was 26 with the kind of lanky, angular frame that looked deceptively casual, until you watched him work, and then you understood that every part of him was precise and intentional, from the way he set up a spotting scope, to the way he moved through terrain, to the way he read people. He had been her spotter for 2 years. He read her expression now the way a musician reads a page of music instantly and completely. His expression said, I see it too. She found him at the armory 20 minutes later. The armory at FOB Ridgeline smelled of gun oil and cold metal and the particular staleness of a space used constantly and cleaned periodically. Ferris was standing near the far wall, ostensibly checking inventory, actually waiting for her. He had the practiced nonchalance of someone who had learned early that being seen talking to someone was not the same as being overheard. This stinks, he said without preamble. Sloane pulled a magazine from the rack, then another. I know. 17 ops and they bench you now. His jaw worked slightly, the tell he had when processing something he didn't like. Who are these guys? I ran the team designations this morning. The records are clean, too clean. She loaded the first magazine. Then the second. Standard combat load for an Overwatch-only mission was 4 magazines. She was taking 8. Ferris noticed. His clipboard lowered. Sloan. I know, she said again. She met his eyes for a moment. There was something she wanted to say that she did not have words for, or perhaps had words for, but could not say, in a building with thin walls and no certainty about who stood on the other side of them. What she settled for was this, watch your 6 out here, Declan. Something feels wrong about all of it. He looked at the 8 magazines on her vest. He looked back at her face. He was 26 years old and very good at his job, and he understood in the way that people in certain professions develop the ability to understand things that have not been said out loud exactly what she was not saying. Come back, he said. That's an order. She almost smiled. You can't order me. You're a specialist. I'm making an exception. She picked up her helmet and her kit and walked to the flight line. The Black Hawk lifted off at 2300 hours. Below FOB ridgeline shrank to a cluster of lights, and then the darkness swallowed even that, and there was only the mountain and the cone and the rhythmic punishment of the rotors against thin winter air. The Bitterroot Range spread out beneath them in the green-tinted world of night vision. Ridge after ridge folding into each other, shadow and contour, the Clark Fork, a silver thread winding through the valley floor far below. Sloan positioned herself near the door gunner. The 5 Delta operators sat in practiced silence on the opposite side of the cabin. She had watched professional soldiers her entire adult life, and she was good at reading the specific language of how people held themselves. These 5 sat too still. Not the stillness of men conserving energy before a mission. Something else. Something with a different quality to it. She watched the mountains. She kept her hand near her sidearm. 20 minutes in, the pilot's voice came through her headset. Approaching phase line Alpha, 3 minutes to target. That was when Voss stood up. The movement was easy, unhurried, a man stretching his legs. But Sloan had spent 5 years learning to read violence in all its languages, and she saw the small hand signal he sent to his team, a gesture so minimal that someone not looking for it would have seen nothing at all. The team shifted, incremental, almost invisible. But she tracked it, cataloging each change in position, the geometry of 5 people reconfiguring themselves in a confined space. Sergeant Mercer, his voice came through the headset, conversational, steady as a flat road. She turned slightly, keeping the periphery of her vision on the other 4. You know what your problem is, he said. Enlighten me. He took a step toward her. Just one. Casual. The kind of step that covered distance without announcing it. You're too effective. He said it the way a doctor describes a diagnosis, factual without judgment. Commands noticed. This whole corridor, the Lolo, the southern approach, the cache networks up toward Missoula, it runs cleaner now than it did before you arrived. Every broker, every mover in the region knows your name, knows what it means when you start asking questions about their territory. He moved slightly closer. In her peripheral vision, she could see the others completing their repositioning. A box. She was at the center of it. That kind of reputation is bad for business. Whose business? The kind that pays significantly better than Army salary. He paused. Harlan isn't just a weapons broker. He's a facilitator. He moves product information access. He's willing to pay very well to remove obstacles. And you are the most effective obstacle in the Northern Corridor. The pieces assembled themselves in her mind with a clarity that was almost clinical. Not a mission, an execution. The briefing, the bench assignment, the 2 clean personnel records, Tully's refusal to meet her eyes. All of it was a frame around a picture that had been painted before she walked into the briefing room that morning. How much, she said. Buying time, running numbers. 50,000 each, Voss said, plus future considerations. Nothing personal, Mercer. You're just too good at your job. The routes need to stay open and you keep closing them. She looked past him at the mountains. So you throw me out of a helicopter and call it an accident. Equipment failures happen in these mountains. He pulled the knife from his belt, quietly the way you pick up a tool you have been meaning to use. The harness fails. The soldier falls. Tragic accident. Full military honors. Sloan ran the arithmetic. 5 operators in a 12-foot cabin at 8,000 feet. She could fight. She had been in worse positions and come out the other side. But 5-on-1 in a confined space was not a problem that skill alone could solve. She could call for the pilots, but the pilots had been chosen for this flight by someone, and that someone had chosen them for a reason. The knife moved. 1 clean arc. The straps fell away. She felt the hands before she could react. The coordination of it was professional, 2 points of contact, vest and collar lift, and push in a single motion that had clearly been rehearsed. The door was already open. The Bitterroot darkness beyond it was absolute and complete. Should have stayed home, Ranger Voss said. And then she was falling. Free fall at terminal velocity is approximately 120 miles per hour. Most people confronted with that velocity with 8,000 feet of nothing between them and the ground, with the sudden total removal of every structure that makes survival possible, most people would spend their last seconds beyond thought, beyond plan, beyond anything except the body's oldest and least useful response to the information that it is about to cease. Sloan Mercer was not most people. She went to work. The first 2 seconds were orientation. She spread her arms and legs into a stable arch using the resistance of the air to stop the tumble, to bring herself level, to convert chaos into something navigable. 3 seconds of pure disorientation, the mountains and sky swapping places, the horizon spinning, and then stability, her body flat and controlled in the rushing dark, the night vision world opening up around her. She had perhaps 35 seconds remaining. Location first. She read the terrain below with the same automation that a pianist reads music, not thinking about each note, but knowing immediately and completely what was there. The valley floor, the tree line, the Clark Fork catching moonlight to the northeast, its surface moving dark and light. She shifted her body. The angle had to be precise. The river was reachable, the geometry was workable, but hitting water from 8,000 feet was not the same as hitting water from a diving board. At this velocity, the surface tension of water approached concrete. The angle of entry was everything. Too steep, and she would shatter. Too shallow, and she would skip across the surface, and the result would be worse than shatter. 20 seconds. She tightened the angle, tracked the river, calculated the approach vector, the way training installs calculation into a person, not as a conscious process, but as the body doing what it knows because it has done it 10,000 times in smaller circumstances, and the knowledge is now structural part of the architecture. She pulled her rifle tight against her body, locked her ankles, positioned her hands to protect her face. 10 seconds. She thought of Leonard Pruitt, who had given her that coin on her first day and died on a wet road on an ordinary Tuesday. She thought of Ferris back at the base watching the clock. She thought of the 8 magazines on her vest and the instinct that had made her load them. She thought, not here, not like this, not for them. 5 seconds. She rotated, feet first angled forward at 45 degrees, toes pointed, muscles tensed but not rigid. The key was penetration, letting the water slow her, rather than stop her slipping into the surface, rather than colliding with it. The river filled her vision. She took the deepest breath of her life. The impact was beyond any vocabulary she had for pain. She had been hit by vehicles. She had been blown back by concussive force. She had broken bones in 3 different states and walked away from each of them. None of that had prepared her for this, the total systemic assault of hitting water at terminal velocity, the shock traveling upward through her feet and legs and spine in a single massive wave that tried to compress her skeleton into itself. Her vision went white, then black, then white again. But she was moving downward, not shattered. The water was taking her velocity, bleeding it off the way a mountain slope slows an avalanche, gradually, grudgingly, but doing it. She plunged into the dark, and the cold hit her like a second impact. The Clark Fork in late February, barely above freezing, every nerve converting immediately to a single signal. She hit the bottom hard enough to crater into the silt. Her helmet cracked against something solid. Her left shoulder announced its dislocation with a clarity that was almost formal. 2 ribs had broken. She felt the structural failure of them, like something fundamental had come loose inside her chest. Her right knee had torn on the rotational force of impact. She lay on the river bottom for approximately 1 second. Then she pushed off. Her legs barely responded. The cold was stealing their function with terrifying speed. Her waterlogged gear tried to anchor her. She kicked with everything remaining, and her head broke the surface into air that tasted like the most important thing that had ever existed. The current took her immediately. She was moving downstream in the dark, the banks scrolling past in the green of her night vision, rocks and ice and tree shadows. Her body had begun the early stages of shock warmth, retreating from her extremities, the clarity of her thoughts developing a faint haze at the edges. She had minutes before hypothermia became the primary threat. The current slammed her into a boulder. The impact added to her accounting, but also pushed her sideways towards shallower water near the eastern bank, and she clawed at it, fingernails breaking fingers barely functional, until her knees found gravel and she could drag herself partially out of the river. She lay on the gravel bar for 30 seconds. Just breathed. Above her, through the tree canopy, the sky was full of indifferent stars. She was alive. She pushed herself up. It took 3 attempts. The first 2 ended with her vision graying and her arms refusing the instruction. The third succeeded on the fuel of something that was not quite anger and not quite will, but lived in the same neighborhood as both. She got to her knees, then to her feet. She stood in the dark on a gravel bar in the Bitterroot Mountains with a body cataloging damage faster than she could process it, and she looked at the sky. Above her, she could hear the Black Hawk's rotors circling, looking for confirmation. They would not find it tonight. The current had carried her a quarter-mile downstream from the impact point. In the tree cover in the dark, she was invisible. She had always been invisible in these mountains when she chose to be. Misamo. They wanted to find a body. What they had created was something considerably more dangerous. She reached into her breast pocket. The challenge coin was still there dry in the waterproof inner pocket she had sewn into every jacket she owned because preparation meant assuming everything would go wrong. She held it for a moment, the worn face of it, the hand-engraved words she knew without needing to read them. Then she put it back and moved toward the tree line. Her knee tried to fold with every step. She did not let it. Pain was information, and information could be received and filed and acted upon without surrendering to it. She had learned this lesson so completely that it had stopped being a lesson and become a fact of her body. She found the cluster of boulders a natural overhang, 4 feet of shelter from above, and the wind, and worked with her one functional arm through the emergency kit. Fire starter, emergency blanket, basic medical supplies. The morphine injector that promised relief from the symphony playing through her skeletal structure. She set the morphine aside. She could not afford the fog. She bit down on her rifle sling, and she put her shoulder back in. The sound it made was wet and final, and she would hear it in quiet moments for years to come. She wrapped her ribs, assessed her knee functional for slow movement, compromised for anything fast. Her rifle had survived. She checked it by touch in the darkness and found it whole. Above her, the Black Hawk's rotors faded northeast. They would be back at first light. She had one night to prepare. Sloan Mercer, 28 years old, Staff Sergeant, 75th Ranger Regiment, 5 years of service in some of the most demanding terrain in the western United States, laid back against cold Montana rock, with a body making detailed complaints in every register available to it, and she began to plan. Voss and his team thought they had eliminated a problem. They had made the oldest mistake that people in positions of power make when they underestimate someone. They had confused her with the job she was allowed to do. They had looked at what she was permitted to be and mistaken it for the limit of what she was. They were about to learn the difference. Dawn came to the Bitterroot slowly, reluctantly, as though the light itself was not certain it wanted to be responsible for what it was about to illuminate. The darkness thinned from black to gray to a pale, washed-out blue that made the snow on the upper ridges look like old bone. The temperature had dropped another 6 degrees overnight. The Clark Fork moved in the valley below, dark and indifferent, carrying no memory of what it had swallowed and given back. Sloan had not slept. She had not tried. Sleep was a resource she would spend when she could afford it, and right now the cost was too high. Instead, she had spent the hours of darkness doing the only thing available to her thinking, mapping the terrain in her mind, cataloging her assets, running the arithmetic of her situation with the specific dispassionate clarity that she had spent 5 years learning to apply to problems that other people would have called impossible. Assets, 1 rifle functional, 8 magazines. Emergency kit, the digital recorder in the waterproof case on her left hip. Standard kit, something she carried on every mission after a debrief 2 years ago, where the lack of a field recording had turned a confirmed interdiction into a disputed incident report. Partial medical supplies. Her knowledge of this terrain, which was not something she could hold in her hand but was in practical terms worth more than everything else combined. Liabilities, 4 broken ribs that turned every breath into a negotiation. A right knee communicating its objections with increasing specificity. A left shoulder back in its socket, but maintaining a continuous low note of warning. A concussion making the edges of her vision behave in ways edges were not supposed to. No radio, no active GPS. No way to reach anyone who might help without simultaneously reaching everyone who wanted to finish what the helicopter had started. By the time the first gray light reached the valley floor, she had a plan. She heard the helicopter before she saw it. The Black Hawk came in low over the valley, working its search pattern with the methodical patience of a team looking for something specific. They were quartering the riverbanks on both sides, hovering briefly over sections of gravel bar and shallow water where a body might have come to rest. Professional, efficient, conducted with a psychology of confirmation rather than discovery, They were not looking for a survivor because they had not left room in their operational framework for the possibility of one. That was their first mistake. The Blackhawks set down on a flat section of riverbank a quarter-mile upstream. 5 figures stepped out and spread into a search pattern within seconds, overlapping fields of observation. Disciplined movement, the unmistakable signature of people who had trained together for a long time. Sloan watched Voss direct from the center of the formation, head moving in systematic sweeps, reading the terrain the way she read it. He was good. She had known he was good. What she was looking for was something else. She found it in the way the team moved. Alert, professional, but not afraid. No elevated tension in how they held their weapons, no hypervigilance at the tree lines. They were 5 experienced operators conducting a body recovery operation in terrain they considered controlled. They believed she was dead. They were behaving the way people behave when the outcome has already been determined, and all that remains is the paperwork. People who believe the outcome has already been determined make mistakes. Sloan settled into her shooting position behind the fallen log. Getting there with her shoulder and her ribs took 30 seconds instead of 5. But she got there. She got stable. She laid the rifle across the log and found her natural point of aim, adjusting for angle distance, and the morning air cold almost still a slight drift from the northwest that she calculated and compensated for without thinking. 800 meters. At 800 meters, Voss was small in her scope, but his radio antenna was visible, a thin black line above his right shoulder catching pale morning light. She tracked it. She breathed. She found the pause between heartbeats where the rifle went completely still. She squeezed the trigger. The antenna exploded in a shower of black plastic and sparks. The sound reached them a fraction of a second after the event, a sharp crack bouncing off the valley walls, multiplying in the mountain acoustics until it was impossible to locate directionally. Voss went down before the echo finished. All 5 of them went down instantly, their bodies making the automatic decision that training had installed before their conscious minds could catch up. She was already moving. Not running, her knee would not allow running on this terrain without risking a fall that would end everything, but moving deliberately away from her firing position and into the tree line, using the timber and the ground contour, the way she always used them, becoming part of the landscape rather than an intrusion into it. She had not fired at Voss. She could have. The shot that destroyed his antenna had passed close enough that he would have felt the displacement of air. That was intentional. The message she had sent was precise and specific, and she needed him to receive it correctly. I am alive. I can reach you from distances you cannot see me. I am choosing right now not to kill you. That choice remains mine. She gave them 2 minutes to process this. Then she put herself into the terrain and began to move northeast. She let them follow. Not obviously. Not in a way that felt like a trail being laid. Just enough of boot print in soft earth here, a displaced stone there, the kind of sign that an experienced tracker would find and a less experienced one would miss, entirely calibrated for Voss's team, who were experienced enough to find it, but perhaps not experienced enough to question why it was findable. She was leading them away from their helicopter, away from their communications, away from the open ground where their training and their numbers gave them the advantage, and into the terrain that belonged to her. The Bitterroot in this section was a maze of broken ground ridgelines intersecting at unexpected angles, draws that looked navigable from above, but were impassable from the inside, game trails that went one direction for a quarter mile and then simply stopped. She knew every one of these features. She knew them in every season, at every hour of the day and night. She knew which deadfall locations created natural obstacles invisible from the trail until you were already committed to the approach. She knew one location in particular, a narrow section of trail squeezed between 2 rock formations about 2 miles northeast of the river, the only reasonably passable route in this section of terrain. On the left, the rock dropped away sharply. On the right, a slope of loose shale angled upward at 30 degrees. And above the trail, wedged between 2 standing trees, was a log that had been there since a windstorm 3 years ago, balanced against a third tree in a configuration that a certain kind of eye would recognize as precarious. She had recognized it the first time she walked through here. She made a small adjustment to the configuration. Not much. Enough. Then she found her next position, a shelf of rocks 60 meters back from the trail, screened by brush, with a clean line of sight to the approach, and she settled in to wait. Waiting was not difficult for her. It was something she had spent years becoming good at, the way a musician spends years becoming good at scales, not because scales are interesting, but because everything interesting requires them as a foundation. She could wait with the patience of landscape which does not experience time passing as an inconvenience, but simply exists through it. She heard them long before she saw them. 4 of them. Voss and 3, she counted footfalls, intervals, the acoustic signature of a 4-man patrol on uneven ground. The 5th was not present, either injured in the scramble for cover after her shot or left back at the helicopter as a precaution. Either way, 4, not 5. The arithmetic was improving. They came into view, moving well, maintaining spacing weapons up. Voss at the front, his antennaless radio looking somehow diminished. Sergeant Holt Briggs on his left shoulder. She identified Rafe Dunbar by his height and the way he moved, and Wyatt Sent at the back of the column, compact and careful. They were tracking her sign. She watched Voss stop, crouch, examine the ground. He looked up toward the trail ahead. He made the assessment that the terrain was demanding him to make and moved forward into the narrow section between the rock formations. Dunbar was last through the narrows, moving quickly, trying to close the gap between himself and Sent in front of him. His boot found the trigger point at a thin root half buried, connected by a length of paracord she had strung in the pre-dawn dark to the base of the balanced log. The log came down, not on Dunbar, she had not designed it for that. It came down across the trail behind him, close enough that the displacement of air reached him before the sound did, close enough that his body made the only available decision, which was to step hard to his right. His right foot found the shale slope. The rest was physics. She heard the ankle from 60 meters away. The sound was specific and unmistakable, followed immediately by one short involuntary sound from Dunbar that was not quite a word, and then the controlled crash of a man trying to manage a fall on a 30-degree slope without releasing his rifle. He reached the bottom alive and conscious and not going anywhere under his own power. Voss had the formation stopped and reorganized in under 15 seconds. Still very good. But now there were 3 mobile operators and 1 casualty. Their pace reduced their flexibility, compromised their distance from the helicopter, growing with every minute. The mathematics of the situation continued their slow, steady movement in her direction. She displaced again. Northeast, deeper into the mountains. Night came back to the Bitterroot with the efficiency of something that had been waiting all day. The temperature dropped below 0. Sloan found a shallow cave on the eastern face of a ridge that blocked the worst of the wind and settled into it with the specific gratitude of a person given exactly one thing they needed at exactly the right moment. Her ribs were conducting an ongoing seminar on the subject of structural damage. The knee had swollen against her pant leg until she could feel the fabric pulling. Her shoulder maintained its low, continuous objection. She sat with her back against cold rock and her rifle across her knees and looked at the darkness outside the cave entrance for a long time. Then she pulled the digital recorder from its waterproof case. She had been carrying it for 2 years. She used it after operations, after training exercises, after conversations. She wanted to document accurately, rather than from memory. She turned it on. The small green indicator appeared barely visible in the dark. She pressed record. She did not speak immediately. The wind moved against the rock outside. Somewhere below, the Clark Fork was doing what it had always done, carrying mountain water south without any opinion about what happened on its banks. For Nora, she said finally, her sister, 24 years old, living in Colorado Springs, teaching 2nd grade. The kind of person who made the world function by caring about its details. They spoke every Sunday when operational security permitted. The last call had been 9 days ago. Nora had been describing a student who had figured out how to balance a ruler on his nose, and they had both laughed at it, and Sloan had thought, this is the most normal thing I have done in 3 weeks, and it is enough. If you're listening to this, she said, then something happened, and I want you to understand what I was doing out here and why. She stopped, began again. I chose this, she said. Not the part where they threw me out of a helicopter, not that part. I mean, the larger thing, the choice to be here doing this work. I know you've never entirely understood it, and I've never been good at explaining it, so let me try now, because I might not get another opportunity that feels this honest. She talked for 6 minutes. She talked about what it meant to be effective at something that mattered. Not famous, not particularly decorated, just effective in a specific and irreplaceable way at work that had consequences in the real world for real people. She talked about the rancher south of Lolo, who had told her through an interpreter that his family had been paying protection to the network she had dismantled for 2 years and could now plant their crops without that weight on them. She talked about what it felt like to walk a mountain at 4 in the morning and know it the way you know your own name. She talked about Leonard Pruitt, who had given her the coin and the words on it, and how she understood Now what he had meant, in a way she could not have understood when she was 22 and new and trying to prove something. He had not meant be clever. He had meant be honest. Honest about what you are, what you can do, what is actually in front of you. She said, I don't know if I'm getting off this mountain, but I know I'm not done yet. She turned the recorder off. She held the challenge coin for a moment, its worn face, its particular weight. The hand-engraved words she had carried across 2 years in 3 states in one frozen river in the dark. Then she put it away and got back to work. The cache was 2 miles northeast. She had established it 14 months ago, the first week at FOB Ridgeline, as standard procedure for long-range reconnaissance operations in terrain this remote. Backup kit positioned at a location logged in her personal notation system, shared with no one. The cache contained batteries, a short-range radio receiver, receive only not transmit medical supplies, protein bars, and a satellite phone with a fully charged battery sealed in waterproof housing. 2 miles northeast through terrain, she knew on a knee that had graduated from single words to full paragraphs of objection. She got there in under 3 hours. The cache was exactly where she had left it, undisturbed. She opened the waterproof box and sat for a moment just looking at the satellite phone, which represented something so straightforward and so enormous that she had to take a breath before thinking about it clearly. She could call Ferris right now, give him her position, tell him what had happened, have a QRF inbound within the hour. She thought about Tully's face in the briefing room, the deliberate non-look, the eyes that had gone everywhere in the room except to her. She thought about the 3 incidents she did not yet know by name, but would come to know well in the weeks ahead. 3 people described in operational language as anomalies, as variances, as outcomes that had not resolved cleanly. 3 people who had mattered to someone the way she mattered to Ferris and to Nora in Colorado Springs. She put the satellite phone in her vest pocket. First information, then the call. She opened the radio receiver and installed fresh batteries. She ran through the frequencies. On the 4th, she found traffic. Voss's team. Encrypted she could hear but not decode. But encryption only protects the words. It does not protect the fact that words are being spoken, the rhythm of them, or the voice at the other end of the line. The voice at the other end was not Voss's. She understood immediately, not from a single word, from the register of it, from the way Voss was speaking to it with a specific deference she had never once heard from him in the helicopter or on the ground. A quality of carefully managed language that soldiers use with people who have the power to end careers with a phone call. She had spent 2 years briefing people in Washington. She knew that register. She pressed the recorder against the radio speaker and started recording. She could not decode the encryption. But Voss's side of the conversation, the confirmations, the status reports, the tone of carefully worded operational language was enough. Package is still active, she heard him say. Request support for final resolution. The voice at the other end was calm and brief and entirely in control. She had heard the phrase final resolution used in 2 different contexts in her career. In both of them, it meant the same thing. What emerged from Voss's half of the conversation was a picture she had half constructed already, but now saw in full dimension. This was not a group of corrupted soldiers making money on the side. The network was structured. It had hierarchy, protocols, oversight from above. The voice at the other end of that call had access to things that required security clearances she could count on one hand. 3 incidents, Voss referenced operational anomalies, he called them, had all been resolved through the same mechanism. Equipment failure, training accident, statistical inevitability. 18 months, 3 people. She was the 4th. She sat with this for a long time. Processing it not emotionally, there was no available space for that, but tactically. If the network extended upward to the level the voice suggested, then the conventional resolution was not clean. Reporting up the chain meant sending information into a system that had already demonstrated its willingness to route that information back to the people who wanted her dead. She needed something that could not be rerouted, in a form that could not be denied, from a source unambiguously inside the network. She began moving south-southwest, back toward Voss's camp. She covered the distance in 2 hours, approaching slowly on purpose. Not speed, patience. The Golos, the locals, had called her, and she moved now the way that name suggested, not invisible, because nothing is truly invisible, but existing at the edge of perception below the threshold of notice, that busy, cold, tired, injured men would spare for the dark around their camp. She heard the camp before she saw it. They had made defensible ground, high position, clear sight lines, 2 guards rock cover. She cataloged all of it, noted the guard positions, Briggs on the north, Sen on the south, and then settled into the most patient version of herself and began the approach. 50 meters took 1 hour. She moved on her stomach, on her elbows, her broken ribs conducting their argument with every inch of forward progress. She breathed in controlled intervals, managing the vapor trail of each breath in the cold air, timing her advances to the moments when both guards were at the far extent of their observation arcs. She was close enough to hear Briggs exhale when she passed him. The camp was 4 sleeping figures, and the low glow of a single tactical lamp pointed down at the ground. Voss lay closest to the light, his injured hand wrapped in a field dressing his tablet on the ground beside him. She lay still for 90 seconds, watching the rise and fall of his chest. Then she reached for the tablet. The screen came alive at her touch, dim but present in the winter dark. She navigated with the focus of a person who has one chance and cannot afford to spend it on anything except exactly the right thing. She found the operational order in 45 seconds. Operation Iron Veil, mission parameters, asset to be removed from active theater by means of staged operational incident, no recovery operation to be initiated, evidence of incident to be cataloged as equipment failure. At the bottom in the digital signature field was a name she had said out loud in briefing rooms and debriefs in after-action reports for 2.5 years. Major Warren Tully, his signature, his authorization code, his command identification number. Not Voss acting alone, not a rogue element. The man who had stood at the front of the briefing room and told her she was benched and not looked her in the eyes when he said it. He had written the instruction for her death and signed his name to it. She looked at his signature for a long moment. Then she pressed the recorder to the screen and read every page aloud into it, clearly, precisely, including every authorization code and every timestamp. A court-readable record. A record that could not be explained away as a hacked file or a fabricated document because it included Tully's voice pattern from the radio intercept and now his written authorization in her own spoken testimony with the tablet serial number logged. She found Voss's satellite phone on the ground charging from a portable battery pack. Her fingers moved across the keypad, quickly translating thought directly into action without the pause of hesitation. She sent one message to a number she had memorized 2 years ago and never expected to use, a number that Ferris checked every morning as part of his security protocol, a number that existed only in his memory and hers. Coordinates, situation, evidence to follow, sent. She placed the phone back exactly where she had found it. Then she laid her hand flat on the ground 6 inches from Voss's face and stayed there for a full second. She could have ended it here. All of it. 5 sleeping men, a knife she was carrying in the dark that covered everything. She was not those people. She needed them alive and talking and accountable in front of a court, not converted into a story about a rogue element that resolved itself in the Montana wilderness with no survivors and no record of who gave the orders. She needed the signature to mean something. She pulled her hand back and began her exfiltration. She was 30 meters from the camp when Voss's eyes opened. She knew it before she could have explained how the specific change in the quality of stillness behind her, the shift in the sound of breathing she had been tracking unconsciously for the entire approach. She kept moving. Slow and continuous, committed to the darkness, trusting everything she knew about how the eye works in low light, how it detects motion before shape, how stillness is a form of invisibility. Then his voice came, low, controlled, almost conversational. "I know you were here, Mercer." She kept moving. "You've already lost," he said. "Even if you make it back, it's 5 of us and 1 of you, and I have the resources to make sure whatever you think you have gets buried so deep it never surfaces." She was 50 meters out now. The trees were closing around her, the camp's light diminishing behind. He began alerting the camp-controlled professional, the immediate transition from sleep to readiness that training builds into a person. She broke into the fastest movement her knee would give her. It was not a run. It was a controlled, committed forward motion that covered ground through the application of everything remaining, which was not much, but was precisely enough because it only needed to be enough until she could disappear. She disappeared. The night closed behind her like water closing over a stone. The satellite phone was in her vest pocket. The recorder was in its case. The challenge coin was against her chest. She had what she needed. Now she needed the main cache 2 miles north, and she needed Declan Ferris to answer on the first ring. She moved through the dark Bitterroot, and she did not look back. The main cache was exactly where she had left it. 14 months ago, on her 3rd day at FOB Ridgeline, she had walked this ground alone on a clear October morning when the aspens were still holding their color, and she had looked at this particular configuration of 3 boulders stacked by some ancient geological event, into a formation that created a natural depression at their base. And she had thought, this is where I would put it. She had put it there that afternoon, told no one, and refreshed it twice since. The satellite phone showed 63% battery. She pressed the contact. Ferris answered on the second ring. His voice had the particular quality of a man who has been awake for most of the night waiting for a call he was not certain would come. There was no performance in it, no forced calm. He said her last name once, just her last name the way he always said it in the field, and in that single word she heard the weight of the past 36 hours. I need you to listen, she said. Record this call. A brief silence, the sound of him moving, accessing his equipment. Recording, he said. She told him everything. Not in the order it happened, in operational sequence. What she had, where she was, what she needed, what the timeline was. She gave him Tully's name and the authorization code from the order she had documented on Voss's tablet. She gave him the frequencies she had monitored and what she had extracted from Voss's half of the transmission. She told him about the recorder, the documentation, where to find the physical cache of evidence she would leave before she moved again. Ferris listened without interrupting, processing the way good spotters process target data completely without letting his reaction contaminate the information itself. When she finished, there was a pause of 4 seconds. Then Tully's been running the QRF coordination since 0400. He told the watch commander you went missing during a navigation exercise, and he's managing the search personally. Tully controlling the search meant Tully controlling what the search found and when and how it was reported. The window was not as wide as she had hoped. Who else knows you called me? Nobody yet. Keep it that way. Go to General Vale directly, not through channels. Directly. Tell him you have evidence of a corrupted operation with authorization at the O5 level, and you need eyes on that evidence before anyone in Tully's coordination loop knows it exists. A shorter pause. Sloan. He said her name differently this time. Not operationally, just the person. How bad is it? The physical situation. She looked at her knee pressing against her pant leg. She breathed the way she had been breathing all night, the shallow, controlled breath of a person who had made a working arrangement with 4 broken ribs. I'm functional, she said. That's not what I asked. I'm functional, she said again. Get Vale. Get to me before Tully's search pattern does. And Declan? She stopped. Found the words simpler than expected. Don't let them make this disappear. He said I won't. Then quieter. You owe me about 40 years of Sunday phone calls after this. Get moving, she said. She ended the call. She spent the next 20 minutes restocking from the cache, batteries, medical supplies, 2 protein bars eaten without tasting. She sealed the recorder and documentation into a waterproof pouch and buried it at coordinates she had already transmitted to Ferris, described in terms specific enough that he would find it in the dark. Then she found a position with line of sight to the extraction meadow, a flat clearing 1 mile southwest, large enough for a Blackhawk, and she waited. She heard the helicopter 40 minutes later. Not Ferris. Too soon, the timeline did not support it. She checked her watch and ran the arithmetic. Ferris needed 20 minutes minimum to reach Vale through unofficial channels. Vale needed time to receive the information, process it, make decisions. Even after decisions were made, there was the physical reality of aircraft and distance. This was not that helicopter. She moved to the edge of her position and looked southwest. Against the pre-dawn gray, she could see the navigation lights of a helicopter running low and fast along the valley floor. Running lights on a helicopter moving with enough confidence that it was not concerned about being seen connected to a coordination structure that had already accounted for who else was in the airspace tonight. Tully's coordination structure. She watched the approach vector. It was heading toward the valley section she had been operating in for the past 6 hours. Tully had extrapolated her likely position from his knowledge of the terrain and from whatever Voss had reported. He had made a correct assessment. She had perhaps 12 minutes before that helicopter began a systematic grid search. She moved southwest toward the extraction meadow. Her knee was a sustained conversation she was no longer engaging with. She had passed the point where it was information and entered the territory where it was simply the environment she was operating in, like weather, like altitude, like the cold that had been her companion since the river. She moved through it the way she moved through terrain, finding the path of least resistance. The forest thinned as she descended. Behind her, she could hear Tully's helicopter working its grid, the systematic back and forth of a search contracting toward her position. Ahead, the meadow opened 300 meters across dead winter grass spawned in the pre-dawn light. A perfect extraction point. Also, for the next few minutes, a perfect place to be entirely exposed to a helicopter equipped with thermal imaging. She stayed in the tree line and pulled her binoculars. Then she heard the second helicopter. A different sound, different altitude coming from the northeast along a heading consistent with FOB ridgeline. She found it against the sky. Two helicopters total, now a Black Hawk, and behind it higher a second aircraft. The cracked lower lens of her binoculars made the tail number difficult. She shifted angle compensating and read the last three digits. She had given Ferris those three digits 2 years ago during a conversation about contingencies. If it's you, make sure it's a bird ending in those numbers. He had written it down. She had trusted him to remember it. The numbers matched. She stepped out of the tree line. She pulled the flare gun, one round. She looked at the sky where Ferris's helicopter was moving correct tail numbers coming fast. She looked toward Tully's helicopter currently behind a ridgeline. To her northeast, its sound telling her it was perhaps 3 minutes from line of sight on the meadow. She pointed the flare straight up and fired. The red star climbed into the pre-dawn sky and hung there brilliant and absolute. Here I am. This is where I am. The flare did not distinguish between the helicopter she wanted and the one she didn't, because the point was not to be selective. The point was to force the situation into the open where the normal rules of operation applied, where you could not make things disappear because too many people were watching. Ferris's Black Hawk banked hard toward the flare. When Tully's helicopter cleared the ridgeline and the pilot saw the flare and the two aircraft converging on it, it did what aircraft do when they find themselves in complicated airspace. It circled at distance, evaluating, recalculating. Ferris's Black Hawk came in fast and dropped onto the meadow with the controlled urgency of a pilot who understood the timeline. The side door was open before the skids fully touched. Ferris was out and running across the frost-hardened grass before the rotors slowed moving with the particular gait of a tall man going faster than tall men are designed to go. He reached her and stopped. He looked at her the way people look at someone they were not certain they would see again, not with relief that announced itself, with the specific quiet of relief that arrives after the other thing has finished and there is finally room. I know, she said before he could speak. He closed his mouth, nodded once. Vale's status, she said. In the bird, Ferris said. He came personally. Through the open door of the Black Hawk, she could see a figure in the cabin, not in flight gear, but in the working uniform of a general officer pulled from wherever general officers are at 4:30 in the morning. General Preston Vale was 61 years old, compact and gray-haired, with a face that had the quality of something tested many times without changing its fundamental shape. He was watching her from the cabin with an expression she could not read at this distance. Behind them, Tully's helicopter had stopped circling. Tell me about the second aircraft, she said. Ferris's jaw set. Major Tully claimed operational authority over the search. He launched independently from FOB ridgeline 40 minutes before I got Vale moving. He said he was conducting survivor search and recovery. She watched the second helicopter begin its descent to the far end of the meadow. That's not what he's doing, she said. I know. He doesn't know yet that Vale is in the bird. He's about to find out. As she said it, the radio on Ferris's vest crackled, Tully's pilot joining the channel, because General Vale's aircraft in the airspace created an obligation to declare and communicate that could not be ignored without consequences that even Tully's network could not manage from the field. She heard Tully's voice for the first time since the briefing room. Even over the radio and the flat processed sound of a military aviation channel, she could hear the specific quality of a man recalibrating in real time. General Vale on scene. Evidence already transmitted. The architecture of the past 36 hours collapsing in the space of a call. Vale's voice came through 1 second later. 3 words. Land your aircraft. The circling stopped. Tully's helicopter settled onto the far end of the meadow with the reluctant quality of something being placed rather than flown. The rotors wound down, the door opened, and Major Warren Tully stepped out onto the frost-covered grass and looked across 300 meters of open ground at the woman he had signed his name to a document to kill. She looked back at him. She had expected anger. The specific heat of a betrayal that went that deep, that had come from that direction, from a person who had stood beside her at memorial services and looked at the mountains with her and used the word trust with the cadence of someone who meant it. What she felt was something colder and quieter and more durable than anger. Something that would still be useful in a courtroom in 3 weeks, when anger would have burned itself out. She turned away from him and walked toward the Black Hawk. Vale met her at the door. He stepped down from the cabin and stood in the meadow grass and looked at her the way a doctor looks at a patient, not with sympathy exactly, but with the specific focused attention of a person whose job is to assess what is actually in front of them. Sergeant Mercer, he said. Sir. He looked at her for a moment. At her knee, at the binding on her ribs, visible above her vest at her face, which she knew from the quality of his attention was communicating things she was not consciously broadcasting. "What you survived," he said and stopped. Seemed to be searching for the word equal to what he was trying to say and finding the available options insufficient. The fall alone, the distance, the impact. "Physics, sir. Physics and 14 months of knowing this terrain." He nodded once, not dismissively. The nod of a person acknowledging something larger than the exchange they are currently having. "I need to tell you something before this goes any further," he said. She waited. He looked at the meadow, at Tully's helicopter, at the figures emerging from it, Tully being placed in a position of controlled non-freedom by two members of Vale's staff, firm and professional, and not asking for his cooperation so much as informing him of its necessity. Vale looked at this for a moment and then back at her. "I received a preliminary intelligence assessment 14 months ago," he said. "Irregular financial flows, unusual access patterns, 3 operational anomalies that did not resolve cleanly in the after-action reports. The assessment flagged a probable corrupted element within the Joint Task Force structure. It did not identify who." She held his gaze. "I commissioned a follow-up review. The review took 6 months and came back inconclusive. I made a judgment that the evidence was insufficient for a formal investigation and that a formal investigation, if it reached the wrong conclusion, would compromise ongoing operations." She heard what he was not saying yet. "I was wrong," he said. "That is not a comfortable thing to tell you, and I am not telling you because it is comfortable. I am telling you because you have the right to hear it from me directly rather than in a hearing room." The 3 individuals referenced in Voss's transmissions, the 3 operational anomalies, those outcomes are partially the consequence of my decisions, as is what happened to you last night. The meadow was very quiet. The sky above the Bitterroot was turning from gray to the first tentative blue of a winter morning. Somewhere up the valley, a raven called once and went silent. She thought about what it meant for a man of his rank and his record to stand in a field at 5 in the morning and say that out loud to a staff sergeant, without hedging it, without routing it, through language that made it smaller than it was. She had spent 5 years in institutions built on the management of accountability, and she knew how rare this was. "Why are you telling me this now, sir?" she said. "Because I'm about to ask something of you," he said. "And I don't ask things of people without giving them the complete picture first." He reached into his jacket and removed a single sheet of paper. He held it without offering it yet. "There are 4 other individuals in the Joint Task Force structure whose access patterns match the profile flagged in the original assessment," he said. Tully was the highest ranking. He was not the only one. What was built here took years and has roots that do not stop at this operation. The evidence you gathered last night is significant. It opens doors. But opening doors and walking through them are different things. He held out the paper. "I am standing up a small internal investigation unit under direct JSOC oversight. No connection to existing chains. No access to personnel with the flag profiles. 6 people vetted independently, cross-referenced against every access anomaly in the past 24 months. The unit's purpose is to walk through the doors that last night opened." He paused. "I want you to lead it." She looked at his face. At the honest complexity of it, a man who was not asking her to forget what had happened or pretend that his decisions had not contributed to it, but who was asking her to decide what she was going to do with herself on the other side of it. She thought about Ferris saying 36 hours ago in an armory that smelled of gun oil, "Come back. That's an order." She thought about the recorder in the 6 minutes she had spent talking to her sister in the dark of a Montana cave and the last thing she had said into it. "I don't know if I'm getting off this mountain, but I know I'm not done yet." She was off the mountain. She took the paper. Vale offered the pen. She took that too. She signed. He took the paper back, looked at it once, folded it, and put it away. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Ferris appeared at her shoulder with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been managing the appropriate distance between himself and the conversation he was not part of. He looked at her face, at the paper disappearing into Vale's jacket. He said, "They want you on a stretcher." She looked at the 2 medics standing with the professional patients beside a stretcher near the Blackhawk's open door. "I'll walk," she said. They looked at her knee. She started walking to the aircraft. Ferris fell into step beside her because this was what Ferris did, not because she needed him to, not because she had asked him to, but because 2 years of working alongside someone created a gravity that operated independent of instruction. He said, "Court-martial or mystery unit." She said, "What do you think?" He was quiet for 3 steps. He said, "I think they threw you out of a helicopter and you turned it into a reason to keep going." I think you are constitutionally incapable of choosing the version of the future that doesn't cost you something. She considered this. The easy version was boring, she said. Her ribs registered a detailed and specific objection to the concept of easy. They reached the Black Hawk. She stopped at the door and looked back at the meadow one last time, the frost-covered grass, the two helicopters, at opposite ends of the open ground, the mountains behind all of it. At Warren Tully, hands now secured, being walked toward Vale's aircraft by people who were not asking for his cooperation. He was looking at the mountains, not at her. She did not know what he was thinking and found that she did not need to know. She reached into her breast pocket. The challenge coin was there, worn smooth on one face, warm from being carried against her body through everything the past 36 hours had asked of her. She held it in her palm. She had thought in the meadow when Vale spoke about placing this coin on his desk eventually, transferring the weight of what was written on it to someone who needed the reminder. A general officer who had admitted in a field in Montana that his judgment had cost people their lives. It had seemed in that moment like the right gesture. She looked at the coin now and changed her mind. Pruitt had given it to her, not to the situation, not to the case she was going to build or the unit she was going to lead. He had given it to her on her first day without ceremony, because he had looked at a 22-year-old who was going to learn that the mountain didn't grade on effort, and he had decided she was worth telling something true. The coin was hers. She put it back. She got into the Black Hawk. 3 weeks later, a court-martial convened at Fort Bragg with a docket running to 47 counts across 6 defendants. Master Sergeant Garrett Voss, Sergeants Holt Briggs, Rafe Dunbar, and Wyatt Sen, Major Warren Tully. A 6th individual whose name appeared in the transmission Sloan had recorded, whose arrest had taken place 11 days after the meadow in a Northern Virginia office building in the company of lawyers who had not anticipated that their client had been recorded by his own operational coordinator, providing verbal authorization for 3 previous deaths and 1 attempted 4th. The court-martial took 11 days. Voss received life without parole. Tully received the same. The others received sentences ranging from 22 years to life depending on their level of involvement and what the prosecutors determined about the 3 people who had been described in Voss's encrypted transmissions and Tully's operational orders as anomalies. Those 3 were now formally identified, formally documented, formally assigned to the causes of their deaths, and those causes formally assigned to the men responsible. It was not justice in the absolute sense, nothing returned what had been taken from them. But it was accountability in the specific permanent court-ordered sense that could not be revised or rerouted or buried in a subsequent assessment. Sloan stood in the same briefing room at FOB Ridgeline where it had all started. Her shoulder was still in a brace under her jacket. Her knee carried her weight without complaint if she did not ask too much of it. The ribs had healed to the point where she could breathe without inventorying the process, which she had come to understand was its own particular luxury. General Vale spoke briefly. He said what he had said in the meadow in front of a room, this time in front of people who wore the same uniform as Warren Tully and who needed to hear it from his rank and with his name on it. He said it without lawyers and without the hedging language of institutional self-protection. He said, I had the indicators. I made a judgment that proved wrong. People were harmed by that judgment. That is on me. The room was very quiet when he said it, not the quiet of discomfort, the quiet of people receiving something true and understanding that true things require a different kind of silence than ordinary information. Afterwards, Ferris found her in the hallway. He said, so. She said, so. He said, how's the shoulder? Functional. He waited the way he always waited, without filling silence with noise, which was one of the things that had made him the best spotter she had ever worked with. She said, the unit stands up in 6 weeks. I have 3 weeks of medical leave and 1 week of administrative setup, and then we begin. I could use a good spotter. He looked out the window at the end of the hallway. Through it, the Bitterroot was visible in the winter distance, white at the peaks, dark with timber in the lower sections, and at the base of everything, the valley where the Clark Fork moved through its ordinary morning. He said, you know what I keep thinking about? What? The 8 magazines. Still looking at the mountains. You took 8 magazines to a mission where you weren't supposed to fire a single round. She said nothing. He said, you knew something was wrong before you walked into the briefing room. Not knew, she said. Felt. The whole morning had a weight that the briefing didn't account for. He nodded slowly. Then start my paperwork, Monday, she said. She walked toward the exit. Her hand found the challenge coin the way it always did, automatically, without thought, the worn face of it familiar as her own pulse against her fingertips. She held it as she walked. She thought of Leonard Pruitt, who had pressed it into her palm on her first day, with the matter-of-fact generosity of a man who understood that the most useful things he could give a young soldier were not techniques or tactics, but the honest terms on which the world operated. She thought of a cave in the Bitterroot where she had sat in the dark with broken ribs and spoken her sister's name into a recorder because she wasn't certain she would get another chance, and had found that having to say clearly what she believed and why she was here had been its own kind of clarification. The kind that comes not from being safe, but from being uncertain about whether safety was still available and deciding that it didn't change the answer. She was still here. The exit door opened into the Montana morning, hard and clear the sky, the particular blue of a February day with no weather in it offering nothing except its own absolute presence. The Bitterroot rose to the west in the distance. Somewhere below the tree line, the Clark Fork moved south through its ordinary Tuesday carrying mountain water toward the sea without memory or opinion, doing what rivers do, regardless of what happens on their banks. She stood in it for a moment, not because the ground was waiting, not because the mountains required acknowledgement, but because she had learned in a helicopter, in a river, in a cave, in a frozen meadow in the space of 36 hours, that the difference between surviving and merely enduring was whether you stopped long enough to know what you were surviving for. She knew. She put the coin back in her pocket and started walking. Behind her, the Bitterroot held its ground the way it always had. Patient, indifferent, ancient in a way that made human patience seem like impatience, and human endurance seem like a brief experiment. The mountains did not grade on effort. They did not reward intention. They did not care about the story you told yourself about who you were or what you had overcome. But Sloan Mercer did not need them to care. She had Declan Ferris, who was already calculating the paperwork. She had a recorder full of evidence that had survived a fall from 8,000 feet and 2 nights in sub-zero temperatures. She had 4 names on a classified list, and 6 weeks before a unit with no official name and no connection to any compromised chain of command would begin the work of walking through the doors that 36 hours in the Bitterroot had opened. She had the coin which was hers, which she intended to keep. And she had the specific, durable, unspectacular knowledge that she was still here, that the ground had tested her, and physics had tested her, and betrayal had tested her, and none of them, not one of them had found the thing in her that quit. That was enough. That had always been enough. The morning held still around her, cold and honest and wide open, and Sloan Mercer walked into it.